My name is Lindsay, and at the time this whole debacle unfolded down was a graduate student at a prominent national university. The story I'm about to relate to you happened over the course of a couple of months in 2005 and became a very transformative occurrence in my life. After 5+ years of sharing apartments and houses with all sorts of folk, be it students who are professionals, male and female, I found myself with a huge apartment, but no one to share it with. I'm not sure how this happened. It seemed to have simply ended up that way. I hurriedly made posts on Craigslist, the local paper's classified section, and any other online place I could. Then I printed up some flyers and pinned those up everywhere. Be it the board at school, the one at the laundromat, or the community board at Barnes & Noble's. I did my level best to paper the city with flyers. The way I figured it, I would need 2 more people to make the rent and live comfortably in the present apartment that left us with a room to make whatever we wanted of it. Library, group meeting room, whatever we could all agree to. Although my name was the one on the lease, I tried to be fair with my other roommates. I didn't want to come across as a tyrant to others. I've lived in situations like that in the past, and it made the living conditions uncomfortable, and I got out of them as fast as I could. Thankfully, it wasn't long before I got my first call. The guy calling's name was Franklin, or Frank for short, and he had a pleasant voice and seemed truly interested in seeing the place. So we agreed to meet at the complex's community room the next morning. My reason for doing this was twofold. To ensure my safety in case he ended up being a wacko, he wouldn't know the exact apartments and would be less likely to assault me in a public place. I'm pleased to say that these precautions turned out to be unnecessary at this time. After completing college out west, he decided to move here because of the area's large number of publishing houses. Taking up writing in high school, his dream became to be the next F. Scott Fitzgerald. He'd always loved the free bohemian lifestyle that Scott Zelda and their friends got to live after they had become published authors. Fortunately for him, he was financially well off because of a check he received yearly from his grandfather's estate. After a few minutes of talking, I felt fairly confident this guy wasn't here to victimize me. The next step was to show him the place and see if he was still interested. I took him on a walk through the apartment, and then we sat down to discuss money. My least favorite part of the whole thing. When I told him what his part would be, he didn't even flinch. I followed up by assuring him the amount would be less once we found another roommate, and he seemed to still be unconcerned. He went as far as to tell me that he would happily pay the rent of 2 of this, would make things easier for me. That seemed more than a kind offer, but I let them know that all the roommates would only be expected to pay their parts and any extra would be absorbed by me. He said that was fine with him, and after going over things for another half hour, he told me he was still interested and handed over his deposit and first month's rent. It had all gone so smoothly, I was shocked. We shook hands and made plans for the day and time he can move in. And that was it. I could only hope the second roommate was as easy to please. Not everyone was independently wealthy and so easygoing. Of course, I went through the motions of calling his references. Those on the other side of the phone all gave him glowing recommendations. So glowing, they made him sound like Mr. Rogers. I couldn't be more pleased. They had made me even more confident in my choice. When the day came, he arrived at the door with only 2 duffel bags and a laptop. I asked when he would be bringing the rest of his things, but he said that was it. My only thought was, man, he's really taking this bohemian lifestyle thing to heart. Since there were still no other roommates, I told him he was free to choose any of the 3 remaining rooms. He pondered his choice for a moment and took the one across from mine. I thought nothing of this at the time. It was the second biggest after all, and truthfully, it's the one I would have chosen most likely. Life with my new roommate was far easier than I'd experienced in the past. Each trip to the market, he insisted on paying for everything. Despite my half-hearted attempts to refuse. He wouldn't take no for an answer. His reasoning was that we deserved to eat well, because we both worked so hard. Besides, since it was just the 2 of us, it wasn't that much anyways. The sentence gave me pause. He made it sound like we were a couple. My thought for a moment. And I give him a reason to think this, and I flirted nurse had something in passing. Nothing came to mind. I must have just misunderstood his meaning. He'd never attempted to get physical with me. And surely he had to know that I was into girls. I quickly put it out of my mind and went on with my day. I never really understood how men thought anyways. About a month and we decided to have a small get-to-know-people housewarming party for him. I invited a few friends from work and people I knew from the complex. It wasn't a massive undertaking. Only about 15 people were invited, and out of that only 8 showed up. Frank made sure we brought plenty of alcohol and food. The night turned out to be a roaring success, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Frank ordained himself the official bartender and wowed me with his extensive knowledge of mixed drinks. The show started the wind down at about 1 a.m. and we spent the next hour cleaning up empties and other assorted party refuse. When we were done, I fired up the dishwasher and sat down on the couch to rest. Soon after, Frank joined me on the couch. I could tell he was still pretty out of it. We sat and discussed how well the party had went. And he mentioned how cool all the people he met were. I'm not sure what I was about to say. But before I could, Frank leaned over and kissed me on the lips. Since it wasn't something I expected, I was understandably very shocked. I wasn't really sure what I should say to him. He just sat there staring at me with a crooked smile. I realized this was something I would have to nip in the bud before it went any further. Despite drinking, he likely did have some sort of feelings for me, and considering we had to live together, it had to be addressed right now. My goal was to make it clear that I liked him as a friend. But we could never have more than a friendship because I wasn't into men. Me turning down his advances was nothing personal. It was a good guy, good looking, but I just wasn't attracted to men. I said I was sorry if he was embarrassed. I didn't mean to hurt his feelings. He said and did nothing except look down and say, "Yeah, sure." After he did that, he trumped off to his room like an angry little kid. I was still buzzing myself a bit and very tired. So I decided to call him tonight. Hopefully Frank would pout in his room for a while and then pass out. Then we'd be able to talk about the whole thing in the morning when we both had clear heads. I couldn't have been sleeping very long. For some reason, I woke up choking and was unable to breathe. I first thought that I was choking on my vomit. But I knew that was unlikely. I hadn't had that much to drink. Once I opened my eyes, I realized Frank was sitting on top of me trying to choke me. Because of my nightlight next to my bed, I could see a space. There was no expression whatsoever. No anger, no sadness, nothing. If by instinct, my body began to fight to get free, but regardless of my kicking and slapping, he continued to choke me. Right as it began to lose hope, I remembered a thing my father told me as a girl. You go for a man's eyes, like poke them out or something like that. Nobody is going to be able to hold on to you. He's going to grab for his eye. It's just human nature. You can cut some sob IR with those claws yet. I realized I had nothing to lose. So I did it. I reached for his right eye socket and jammed my thumb into it. It didn't take long before I felt the eyeball pop out. And sure enough, he grabbed for it, and that was my chance. He stood up next to the bed screaming with his right hand over the socket holding, and his blood poured down in space. I couldn't help but cough over and over. But I knew the eye thing wasn't going to keep his attention forever. So I grabbed my phone from my nightstand and ran into my bathroom. Slamming and locking the door, I dialed 911 and hit enter. He began beating on the door and attempting to get in almost before I could lock the knob. I guess he heard me yelling at the 911 operator because the beating and screaming quickly stopped. The operator kept me on with her until the cops arrived. I'm glad she did because it helped me keep my mind off my agonizing throat. The officers had me relay a description of Frank to them. They had a couple of more units searching the neighborhood for him. I assured them he would be hard to mess. odds were against them that they'd encounter another guy with his right eye hanging out. And wasn't long before I heard the call on their radio saying Frank had been found. The car carrying him brought him back to the complex for me to give them a visual confirmation, and of course, they had the right guy. "Franklin, look at me." He was looking down, still holding his hand over the dangling eyeball. Once I'd confirmed, they took them away to the hospital, and I would soon follow in the back of an ambulance. Fortunately, they weren't able to save the eye. I've done too much damage to it. Not only had I pulled out my long nails, had managed to slice it up. He hadn't been able to do a whole lot to me. My eyes looked like the whites were full of blood, which I guess they were. In addition to the bloodshot eyes, it was hard to talk for a while, and my neck had hand-shaped bruises on it. My voice sounded like some old woman that had smoked Camel Straits for 1,000 years. But overall, I got out relatively okay physically in the long run, but mentally, things weren't so peachy. My path down the road to peace had been a long one, and I don't see things ever going back to the way they used to be. When it comes to the case, Frank took a plea and, in all likelihood, won't be out until he's 50. His lawyer assured him he would certainly get a much harsher sentence from a jury, considering his prior record and reputation. And yeah, about that. His whole nice guy, aspiring writer in love, by all things was a giant fraud. Back where he's from, he was in equal parts feared and hated. He had been in and out of trouble with the law since he was 12. And the only reason he had received such glowing references from everyone was he had threatened them and their families. They had been more than happy to get them out their city and away from them. Basically, he was the town bully. The craziest thing out of the super crazy story was that he did receive yearly checks from his grandfather's estate. The old man had invented paper clips or something crazy like that. The whole family was drowning in money. The problem was he turned into such a psychopath. He grew up thinking he owned everyone in the small town he lived in. As for me, it took almost being killed to realize I didn't need to live with a group of strangers to meet people. I finally got rid of that big apartment and moved into a cozy one-bedroom. If I felt the need to socialize, my neighbors were happy to visit with me a while and talk. One of my neighbors turned out to be a wonderful guy. And we actually got married 5 years ago and are more than happy sharing a modest 3-bedroom house with our son. When it comes to the long-term effects of the attack, my voice is a tad rougher than it used to be, and therapy is still a big part of my life. However, I try not to let those things get me down. It could have all ended that night, with Frank's hands wrapped around my throat. Since this is a recent story, the pain stemming from it is still very strong. After reading this, you'll understand why, being a poor person without insurance, my boyfriend and I of course are unable to afford counseling. And besides, I doubt he would be willing to do it anyway. Despite the fact that his constant facade of strength often gets on my nerves. At this point, I realized one of us has to be the strong one in the relationship, and that is certainly not me. Following a discussion with my sister, I decided to committing this story to paper may serve as some form of therapy. Before I get to the heart of my story, I must tell you how we got there. My boyfriend Mike and I had only recently moved to Arkansas because of a transfer he'd received at work. This transfer also came with a raise and promotion. It came at a perfect time considering I had also just discovered I was pregnant. I got a part-time job at a bookstore so we could have a little extra pocket money. It also gave me an excuse to get out of the house once in a while. Having no friends, I'd go crazy sitting at home all day while Mike was at work. When it came time to quit because of the impending birth, they assured me if I wanted to come back in the future, that would be a job for me. I thanked them, but I had no intention of working another job until our son started school, at least maybe longer. The big day came in after 10 hours of sheer exhausting pain. Our beautiful boy was born. By the time Mike Jr. and I got to go home, Big Mike had to go back to work. Since he was a supervisor, he was free to make his hours and take off for the days as long as he was no longer needed. He would often come home for lunch and take an hour off to spend time with his newborn son and help me out if I needed it. Life in our home was darn near idealistic for nearly a year. That was until the company laid my golf. Although he was receiving unemployment that came nowhere near to making up for what we had last. For a moment I considered returning to the bookstore. But since Mike and I had always disagreed with childcare, we decided against it. The following weeks were a trying time until we realized a sure steady source of income was looking us right in the eye. We remembered we had a guest house. This wasn't exactly your stereotypical guest house full of lavish furnishings and the like. It was actually a converted pool house/shed that the landlords had converted for their teenage son to live in a palace, by far, but nice enough for a single young person. We'd been using it for a storage place for old baby things, and we'd find another place for that stuff. It meant we could create another source of income. And that's just what we did. We sat down to brainstorm what the wording of the ad would be. And after 3 hours of back and forth, this is what we came up with. Young friendly couple with newborn son looking for single female under 32, rent guest house $300 a month, may need to babysit on occasion. Call with our number 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Mike wasted no time in posting it. It was put in the usual places like our local newspaper and Craigslist. Once it was up, we had to do the hard part and wait. Fortunately for us, it didn't take long. The first few calls came from stupid little boys pretending to be girls, I guess because they thought it was funny. But the next morning was when Charlie called. Charlie was a 23-year-old girl from Fayetteville that worked at Golden Corral. Lucky for her, the location she worked at was only about a 15-minute drive from our place. So far, so good. She went on to say she had been single for almost a year and had no intention of changing that anytime soon. Her father was a preacher in Fayetteville and her mother had been a nurse before she passed away from breast cancer 10 years ago. From what I could tell on the phone, she seemed to be a quiet and down-to-earth girl. After speaking to Mike, we decided to invite her to see the place. She showed up the next afternoon after her lunch shift at work. We all sat at the dining room table and discussed exactly what we expected of her, and she seemed pleased with everything. After we showed her around the guest house, we left her alone for a moment to make up her mind. Just a minute later, she returned to tell us she wanted to rent the place. And we all shook hands to seal the deal. In order to ensure her spot, she gave us $150 for deposit. When we all found the day we were all free. We set the Friday up for her to move her stuff, and we took her into the nursery and introduced her to Mike Jr. They talked to each other right off. All things looked to be on their way up, and I was able to relax a bit for the first time in quite some time. Friday afternoon came and Charlie arrived at to Mike, and I helped her move her few pieces of furniture into the guest house when we were done by 4. To celebrate, I cooked a big dinner of spaghetti and garlic bread. We all ate well, and Mike and I decided to call it an early night and turn it in around 9 p.m. The next few weeks carried on as normal, and Charlie would join us sporadically for dinner. She even offered to babysit for us one evening so we could go see a movie together. From all appearances, she was a model renter and we all got along well. About a month and a half after moving in, I asked Charlie if she was free to babysit that evening so Mike and I could visit a family member that was in the hospital in Fayetteville. She said she was more than happy to do it. So we left that day around 5 p.m. We took our time visiting our loved one and decided to stop off and get some takeout. While we were at the restaurant, we picked up some food for Charlie, also as a way to say thanks. When Mike pulled into the driveway, we noticed that Charlie's Subaru was gone. This struck me as strange since it was there when we left and she was supposed to be home watching Mike Jr. With some bit of trepidation, I entered the house and soon realized one of my darkest fears. After a 30-minute frantic search, we were forced to finally acknowledge the truth. Charlie had kidnapped our son. I must have called her phone 30 times, but never got an answer. Mike did most of the talking to the police. Every time I started to say anything, I'd lose control of myself and yell, "Please find my baby," and break down crying. He gave the authorities every bit of information we had on Charlie. But unfortunately, most of it was a lie. It wasn't until the next morning the police discovered Charlie's real identity. Apparently her real name was Rose, and she had only been in Fayetteville for a few months. She had moved there from Missouri where she was living with her boyfriend and their newborn son. The whole situation gave me the chills because of its similarity to Mike's and my life. Sadly for her, their son died soon after coming home from unknown causes. But the medical examiner thought it was most likely SIDS, or sudden infant death syndrome. I had a brief pang of sympathy for her, but my anger quickly drowned it out. The police had brought in the FBI soon after they discovered the true identity of Charlie. The prevailing theory was that she would either return to Missouri or at the Kansas, where her mother was currently living. More than likely she would head to Kansas. Her mother had a history of helping her daughter out of jams with the law, and the feds hoped they could convince her to give Charlie up if she contacted her. There had been a couple of reported sightings of her and little Mikey, but they had been in two different directions. A week into the search was beginning to lose hope. And as a result, my grasp on my own sanity was slipping. Many times a day, I found myself begging God to bring my baby home. I had never been a very religious person, but you put in circumstances like this, you learn how easy it is to become connected to Him and how much belief has to do with comforting oneself in trying times. Thankfully, that following week the fence called us and said that Charlie had contacted her mother, and she was making her way to her. Charlie told her that she had been moving very slowly, staying in various places for days at a time and driving only at night. When her mother asked her if Mike Jr. was okay, Charlie assured her that he was fine and she would never harm him. When the cops told us this part, particularly, I felt relieved. A small part of me was afraid that she had done something terrible to Mike Jr. out of spite against all of us women with healthy living children. In order to gain her trust, Charlie's mother had told her to stay away from her house. The police were watching her place. Instead, she had rented a motel room for her on the outskirts of town. And when she was able to get away, she'd come see her. Charlie bought the story, and once she had checked into the motel, the cops waited for their opportunity to strike. Later that night, they saw their chance and took it. Around 11 p.m. she stepped away from the room to get some ice. Mike Jr. was alone in the room, so they had no fear of harming him during the arrest. When returning from the ice machine, the cops approached her from all directions and arrested her with no problem. The moment the FBI called us and told us their plan, the local detective volunteered to drive us up to Kansas so we could be there when Mike Jr. was saved. We had been waiting at another motel just a few miles away waiting to get the okay to pick him up, and at 11:15 that night, we were finally reunited with her beautiful baby boy. The paramedics were on the scene to check him for any injuries, and as we'd hoped, he was fine. I could see Charlie sitting in the back of a cop car. The urge to scream at her and ask her why almost overwhelmed me. But in the end, I guess we already knew why. Once the trial finally began nearly a year later, the true extent of Charlie's, or Rose's, whatever you want to call her, plan was brought to light. She claimed that she had no intention of kidnapping anyone's child when she came to Arkansas. Her only desire was to start her life over and move on from her son's death. But when she saw the ad, the idea of taking Mike Jr. started to form. When she saw him, she fell in love. And that was it. Of course, she said she felt bad about doing it to us, because we had become like her friends. But her love for Mike Jr. and her grief over her own loss overruled her mind. Despite her multiple attempts to get the jury sympathy, she was found guilty in order to ensure she would receive the harshest sentence. The local judge chose to let the feds try her. And as a result of this, she was given 20 years. You better believe that Mike and I will be at every one of her parole hearings to make sure she serves every day of that 20 years. Well, that brings us back to the present. I'm sorry if at the beginning of this, I may have given you the impression that my child had passed. That was not my intent. Well, I recognize that losing a child permanently is a far worse thing. I hope at least a few of you out there can understand the constant fear that I live with every day, and if it's something you can carry with you too long, you can become unhinged. While I may not be the happy-go-lucky girl I once was, sharing my story with all of you has lifted a small weight from my heart. My greatest hope is that Mike Jr. was far too young to be harmed by this painful episode. And he can grow up to be a well-rounded and happy man. Mike and I have done our best to carry on as before, dealing with our pain and fears the only way we know how, if not for the good of ourselves, certainly for the good of our son.